Oh, is that right, is it? Oh, my apologies. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And it's a great privilege to rise in support of this motion in discussing these important issues raised by the member. And in fact, he and I occasionally work together, particularly on human rights challenges around the world, particularly in relation to Vietnam. It's an issue that both of us are very concerned about, and making sure that we have a global community where people are free to stand up, exercise their voice, and exercise their freedom, because freedom is not something that is gifted by government. It is a God-given right, and it is people's freedom to be able to choose how to live their lives, and I don't care how they do it, so long as they adhere to that old lock-in principle of doing no harm to others. But when you look around the world today, and obviously in my former role as Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, I had the great privilege of working on lots of different human rights issues, whether it was Vietnam and speaking to bloggers in the Australian embassy hold-up against the will and wishes of the Vietnamese government to stand up for their free speech and be able to criticise their government and their freedom of religion, whether it was in Europe or speaking at EU conferences talking about the challenge around data privacy and encryption and national security laws, and that was just after the Batlacan theatre attack, so it was topical and relevant, whether it was in Thailand with the United Nations organisation, one arm of the United Nations, talking about the freedom of LGBTI people to live their lives freely across the world, or in the United States, particularly talking about the challenge around religion and freedom. And I was very privileged to be able to represent our great nation at the launch of the Free and Equal campaign at the United Nations in New York. This issue sits amongst a patchwork of many global human rights challenges, because one of the things, Deputy Speaker, is the task of advancing the cause of human rights never ends. There is always a threat to people's freedom somewhere on earth. Always. That's because human beings are fallible and flawed, and also because there are always people who want to use centralised power to crush people or individuals because they want to impose their will, because it's easier than persuasion, reason and leadership. And that's why when we look at challenges in our own region, particularly in countries like the Philippines, it raises an eye and a brow from many people in here, because we are disturbed by the deteriorating plight of the circumstances that exist in the Philippines, particularly around the extent of arbitrary detention and limitations of freedom of movement on political officials, but also, of course, what has now been a long history of efforts by the government and the President to be able to impose their will, and in some cases with horrific circumstances. So that's the basis in which I rise to support the motion and the resolution, and I'm very conscious of the political sensitivities that do emerge between our two countries. Of course, we try and get along with our neighbours and the countries in the region, but if we're to be credible voices in the international community, we shouldn't be afraid of standing up either. We can't do so in isolation. We need to work with our other countries and other countries in the region and partners in the region to deliver a comprehensive approach of persuasion, to work with the Philippine government to make sure that it understands its obligations, not just to the international community, but more critically to serve the best interests of the citizens of their nation. And the best way to do that, yes, is you need to have strong laws and you need to enforce them. People should respect the rule of law. It's one of the foundations of having a proper country with a human rights framework, but that a country is not built from, whether it be technocrats or bureaucrats or political officials down. Just like, respectfully, Deputy Speaker, while I respect your great and illustrious office, we here do not run this country. It is the 25 million Australians who run this country, and we merely serve them and represent them to fulfil and deliver a rule of law to enable them to be able to live their lives. And there are no, in every other country, there is no difference, because the contract that sits between citizens and their government is it is there to serve them, not to direct them or impose them. We are not mere puppets or vehicles to achieve some centralised force or order imposition on others. So we know that there are great challenges around the world, and there are perpetual threats to human rights everywhere. We have to be very mindful of working with our neighbours and very, very constructive partners, but we also can't turn a blind eye to the reality when we see senators who are detained on non-bailable charges, that there are serious issues and that we as legislators here have to turn around and defend the rights of legislators elsewhere for their freedom and to stand up for the type of country they want to be.